Good evening. This is the Pale Criminal. Tonight I'm going to talk about bilingualism. Uh, if you're watching this from outside of Canada, I am not sure exactly what regulations you might have. Official bilingualism in Canada, and more particularly in New Brunswick, here where I live, uh, was generated starting in 1969 at the federal level and in the 70s at the provincial level. Um, Officially, it was aimed at generating more equality in our society. Its implementation has resulted in, well, frankly, a constant barrage of negative reactions. Um, it's become a central piece of everyday politics in New Brunswick, actually. Uh, I'm going to take a quick look at the official word on the subject and then discuss the problem with its implementation. First of all, officially speaking, uh, the Language Act was made in order to offset a long history of language inequality in Canada. Uh, there were two primary language groups that settled the country, the French and the English. And for the bulk of the first century, the English had priority over virtually everything, every aspect. Now, there can be arguments made about the distinction in Quebec politics and the fact that Quebec was a French culture first province and that kind of thing. But the reality is that even there, uh, the English did have a political authority far outweighing their population. Um, Setting up this Language Act was designed to set up a duality of services to level the playing field uh, in many aspects of the country's activities. And frankly, there was a serious concern for minority rights throughout the country. Um, at the end of the day, really, only two realms saw a distinct impact from the legislation. Uh, federal Federally, it had an impact on the bureaucracy, on the number of people involved in various departments within the federal government being rather French rather than English. And provincially here, you saw um, far more involved activity aimed at leveling, creating more equality in every aspect of New Brunswick society. Implementing that plan is and always will have barriers because what you're really trying to do is to implement equality. And legislation is just not going to be able to create a perfect environment. Um, you can change the dynamics within government offices by changing hiring policies, but that's not necessarily going to change the basic framework of the society. Uh, One of the big things that we did see and did experience was recruiting changes aimed at employment objectives that would create a more egalitarian scenario within every level of government. In a lot of respects, an argument can be made that the costs of such implementation far outweighed the positive results. Uh, Part of the reason for that is the implementation requires a prejudicial hiring policy. In order to increase the number of French-speaking people within various levels of government, you had to restrict hiring to French-speaking people. Uh, in a lot of areas where the population was not balanced, not equal, that meant that a lot of people, like myself, were not eligible for most jobs within the government. I want to talk a little bit about how they've been able to balance the costs, both real and social, with the benefits of the policy. Primarily since its creation in 1969, the Language Act has struggled to create a bilingual environment where both official languages have relatively equal representation. The primary cost of this act was creating an availability of officials who could speak in either official language so that all members of both groups could receive their services. Education probably would be the largest piece of that. Provincially here, it saw the creation of a French school system that was implemented in every community where there was a significant population of French speakers. And likewise, you would see a Anglophone school system in areas where the bulk of the population were French, and hence most of the education had been only in French. The downside, I suppose, in one sense, to the implementation of the policy was what I would say is an inevitable expectation of some of the citizenry that everyone they communicate with would be able to work in either official language. Practicality-wise, that would be nearly impossible. There are any number of career choices that do not lend themselves well to people who are comfortable learning multiple languages. It's a brain process. Your regular linguist is not usually mathematically inclined, for instance. So having a computer tech who's bilingual, unless they were brought up in a community where they were immersed in both cultures regularly and learn it as a aspect of growing up, you're really not going to see that mind spend a lot of time learning a second language. Having said that, the benefits of having this policy that allows people to access programs within the government, whether it be educationally or criminal, the idea that no matter where you are in the country, if you're in court, you can require to speak in your mother tongue is a pretty big benefit. I don't think that anyone can really come out with a good denial of that type of benefit. The biggest concern that I have with official bilingualism is how it was misrepresented politically. Um, the official act, for instance, does not guarantee that officials must be bilingual. Uh, it guarantees you the right to request service in your language. But in many cases, that could practically mean having to wait for service. The reality is that many aspects of the act require significant political will for success. And if the basic underlying need for the act was a lack of political will to begin with, then you're going to see a number of other types of problems cause that act and the ideals involved in it to flounder somewhat. At the end of the day, really, most of the act really just allows for what I would say the correct access to services. You can't have a welfare state mentality and then not allow 30% of the population to have access to it. That doesn't make any sense. Having said that, reality is that a lot of what they were trying to achieve with the Language Act was aimed at removing prejudice from our society in general and from the political realm in particular. Um, and I think a lot of times people forget that prejudice in all its ugly formats is not limited to one culture or one language group. And it's going to create roadblocks to the implementation of an egalitarian process. In conclusion to this conversation, at least, I want to talk more about New Brunswick itself. Um, the local implementation of the Language Act has caused a lot of concern over the years. I mean, we've had political parties whose primary focus was to eliminate bilingualism in the province. Um, that concerns me because really bilingualism itself can only provide benefit for any community in which it exists. If you look at most European nations, there's not one language group that does everything. Predominantly, you have two, possibly three different cultures that have full access to services. And it's not unusual to have a large portion of the population. Now, I'm not saying a majority, 70% of them or anything like that, but to have a large portion of the population that speak two or more languages comfortably. Having said that, the people that are able to function in multiple languages aren't people that were trained briefly in a second language while in school enough that they can pass some test. Bilingualism really should be aimed at benefiting people that can function in multiple languages. And I'd like to see that as a highlight. Uh, local implementation of the Act in New Brunswick, by and large, has created a number of things. Education for, French immersion programs all over the province and actually in other parts of the country as well have been the focus of a lot of government funding. I haven't seen an awful lot about English language immersion, which is interesting because we do have a huge portion of our province that is primarily French. And they don't have the capacity within those communities to learn a functional English. So what you end up with is the exact same as if I was trying to function in French with limited amount of knowledge, school knowledge that I received. It's not going to work. You're not going to understand my French, particularly not my limited spoken French, because they're very different language structures. I think a lot of our concerns were based on the implementation of the act as opposed to its intent. I know myself, there have been many times when I was frustrated with how structurally these things were set up. And I know a lot of us have called into a government office and got someone who didn't speak English to a degree that we're comfortable with. In our, business contacts, we have the same kinds of things happen. You call and you get someone who is speaking language as a second, or English as a second language, or French as a second language, and communicating with that individual is very difficult. I would much rather have someone on the other end of the phone who functioned in my language and, if necessary, was able to refer to somebody who functioned in the other official language to provide service. I think really at the end of the day, though, that our energy should be set on holding our officials responsible for correctly implementing this policy rather than trying to repeal the act or fighting over culture in this sense of, one group being preferential over the other, that kind of thing. The Language Act was set up with the intent of guaranteeing a functional equality between the language groups. It was never, ever, ever set to create a bilingual society in the sense of everyone speaking both official languages. I don't think anyone involved in it back in the 60s had any illusions of that. However, that's really been a larger focus on our community than anything else, and I think an awful lot of energy and money has been spent on the wrong aspect of the act. You let me know. I'm going to cut her off here. Try not to go quite as long as I did last night, and we'll step on from here. Thanks again for listening.